Today we're going to talk about science and Christianity, but let's start with prayer. Father, we ask that you take this time today and you help us to look at this topic and just get a good understanding of where each belongs and the ultimate reality, are still just over all things. We give this time to you in Jesus' name, amen. All right. I don't know, when if anybody asked you when you were younger what you want to be when you grow up, one of the three things I chose was scientist, which I wasn't exactly. I studied electrical engineering, but a lot of young people today, and even back then, it wasn't that long ago, when I was younger. So, really love science. But here's a common complaint, we see today. For example, my scientific training makes it difficult or impossible to accept Christianity, right? As I believe in evolution, I can't accept the Bible's pre-scientific accounts of their origin of life. And another, the Bible's filled with accounts of miracles. Med students says it simply could not have happened. Very common complaint. So the question is whether science precludes religion, and Christianity in particular. A very famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, he writes, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And he says you can't accept science and still be religious. And he claims only 7% of American scientists in I think the National Academy of Sciences believe in a personal God. Right? There's a survey done of this. Bertrand Russell, he was an atheist philosopher who claimed atheism is the source of science. So atheism, created science and it stamped out this united religious ideas. So he claimed that believing in God's intervention in nature actually obstructed science. So what do you think he meant by that? Well, it's a common view that believing in God obstructs science because you just say, oh, God did that, and you don't have to look for answers, right? So that's a common view that's been perpetrated. Here's the other complaint: miracles are scientifically impossible. So how important are miracles to the Christian faith? I mean, can we be Christians and still say, yeah, I don't really believe in miracles either?
Yeah, I would think it's like central and key to biblical Christianity, but maybe there are some branches of theology where miracles are not accepted.
Why is it central to what we call biblical Christianity?
Jesus rose from the dead, and that God intervened miraculously through the virgin birth.
So really, like Paul wrote that the resurrection is the central claim of Christianity, right? So if the resurrection, which is a miracle, didn't happen, then we're all wasting our time, right? And of course, other things like the virgin birth are important to the theology of Christianity. I don't believe in that Jonah was swallowed by a fish, but then once you start believing in miracles, then you can't really believe in the central claims of Christianity. So we're going to ask ourselves, as with all of these types of claims, what is the faith that is embedded in the above claim? Miracles are scientifically impossible. What's the hidden belief in that claim?
I think the hidden belief in that claim is that, science deals with structure and logical reasoning and evidence. And so where you cannot logically reason out based on the facts and other information, then you think it is impossible to achieve.
Okay, all right. So it has to be verifiable by science for it to be true. Mm-hmm. Okay, any other thoughts on this?
Also because science is structured. There's a process behind everything they do. So something cannot just happen. If it happens, they will try to find an explanation for it to justify why it happened.
So really, the assumption that's hidden in the claim that only natural causes that are scientifically explainable are permitted, right? Now, it's interesting because later on, we'll see that really there are a lot of things which science really still hasn't explained. And are they going to call those miracles? So that's a problem. And can this be proven, this belief? It doesn't seem like something that can really be proven. I mean, how can you prove this? So really, it's a statement of faith. It sounds like a scientific criticism, but in the end, it looks like a religious reason, right? It's something that can't be proven, that miracles are scientifically impossible. Only scientifically explainable causes exist. So one way someone has responded to this is this way: you have someone looking for a quarter that he dropped, and the policeman asks, "Did you drop it here?" And the guy says, "No, I dropped it 2 blocks down the street." And the policeman asks, "Well, why are you looking for it here?" And the guy says, "Well, the light is better over here." So this is the problem that is inherent in that viewpoint. It's because it's hard to find what I'm looking for in the dark. It must be where I'm just going to continue under the light. Maybe it's the wrong light. Maybe another. Anyway, so here's the other belief: God can't do miracles. Is this a reasonable objection? And I think Dayo, you already answered some of this, right? I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this.
God can do miracles because he's our creator, so he can do anything he wants.
True. Now, but here's another variation on this objection. God can't do something that's scientifically impossible. How about that?
If we say God created everything includes science. So science originates from God. So if it comes from God, then the claim that it's only anything verifiable by science exists. Again, it takes us back that they are limited in knowledge.
Mm. So, yeah, right. So if you watch a lot of sci-fi, like example of this, time travelers, right? People look at your smartphone and say, no, this is not possible, right? It's a miracle, but it's just an advanced being, creating something. So of course, again, if God has created the laws of the universe, really he can do anything. It's not really a reasonable objection.
Would contest that miracles are illogical. So of course they wouldn't believe that there's a God, right?
What do they mean by illogical?
That everything is based on hypothesis and findings and actually evidence-based. So this notion that there is a God is just too illogical for a scientist to accept, right?
The notion of God's existence?
Yeah, it's just too illogical to believe that he can do miracles because it's not scientifically based. Is that kind of a thinking by the
Yeah,
scientist?
I think that's the mindset. God seems like an escape hatch, right? We will like to explain everything in scientific terms. So the idea of God is kind of, so I think I see God as antagonistic to that effort. So that's certainly one objection. But we'll see whether that's really the case. But that is an objection to think about. Okay, is God unscientific? And again, going back to the previous thought, if God is an advanced being and we are not as advanced, a lot of things may seem like miracles to us, but not to him, right? So Star Trek, if someone comes back from Star Trek and uses a phaser on us, we may say, hey, what's that? I mean, today we would believe it more easily, sure. We've seen so much sci-fi. But anyway, I think we'll circle back to that. So the most common topics when we're talking about science and Christianity are evolution, the creation, whether God created the universe. When we say science and Christianity are in conflict, what are the beliefs that are embedded, hidden in this claim? God is kind of an illogical concept, perhaps, or well, I think something that's kind of a common belief is scientists can't believe in God. Another one would be that science disproves God. That's why God seems illogical. Another common thought would be science makes God unnecessary because it's already explained everything. So we don't need God. God is just like, icing. If you want to believe in God, yeah, but we don't really need him. Oh, here's another one, which is similar to, kind of related to what you said, which is belief in God messes up science by just not requiring an explanation. Oh, we don't need to investigate that scientifically. God did it, right? So that's the belief. So let's take a look first at this claim of conflict. And it's very interesting because historically, this claim, which is a problem today, was invented at the end of the 19th century. There were two people in particular who wrote about it and made this claim, and it just kind of caught on, right? But actually, it was invented to increase their own power, right? Their own cultural power. Is it an accurate claim? Well, we'll take a look at that. But it's kind of interesting that two people just started off with this claim, and other people just jumped on it. Alistair McGrath, you might have read a couple of his books. He says, really, most atheists that he knows are not atheists because of science. They're atheists due to other reasons, right? Whether they're social reasons or philosophical reasons, emotional reasons, and so forth. Something that Richard Dawkins points to, a survey given to the National Academy of Sciences, which are American scientists, whether you believe in an intelligent being who communicates with us. And the results of that survey in NAS were only 7% responded positively to that question. But here's another interesting quote. So you may be familiar with Stephen Jay Gould. He was a very prominent evolutionist, scientist, and writer. And he says, either half my colleagues are enormously stupid, or else the science of Darwinism is fully compatible with conventional religious beliefs and equally compatible with atheism. Why would he say that? He knows a lot of scientists who do believe in evolution, right, Darwinism, but they're also really intelligent. So here's a survey from 2019 of 10,000 scientists. And there's some interesting results here. Nowhere near 7%. Some believe there's a conflict on the side of religion. Some say side of science. They side with science. Some say not sure which side is very, very small percentage. Some say they're completely independent. A smaller percentage believe there's a collaboration between science and faith. The people who say science is maybe less religious are somewhere around 20% or less. Rodney Stark, who's a historian of philosophy or something like that, who's written a few books, he says that actually the number of scientists who do believe in God have actually started increasing in recent years. I didn't have a chance to find those stats. But Michael Ruse is an atheist philosopher, and he responded to Dawkins' claims in this way. He says, Dawkins is brazen in his ignorance of philosophy and theology, not to mention the history of science. So when Dawkins claims that, science is an incompatible religion, Michael Ruse, who is an atheist, says, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And I have had the pleasure also of years ago debating online in a forum, and an atheist responded to me, said, science and Christianity are just, not compatible. And another atheist jumped in, and he was a scientist. I think he was a physicist, a biologist. He said, you don't know what you're talking about. You have no clue about what you're saying. If you look at the history of science, it is indeed very much compatible with Christianity. So what would they mean by this? If you look at the development of science, you'll see that science is actually a gift from God. Bertrand Russell was an atheist. He was writing with a guy named Alfred North Whitehead on some stuff. And he shocked Western intellectuals when he said, Western science sprung from the Bible. From the Bible's teaching, the cosmos was the product of the intelligible rationality of a personal being. This concept led to modern science. And that China, full of smart people, as in India and the Middle East, they failed to develop modern science because they didn't believe in a lawgiver, right? And when I say lawgiver, in this case, we mean that God is the giver, not just of moral law, but also of natural laws. It was the Chinese philosophy that hindered them from developing science. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Joseph Needham. He's a very famous Marxist historian, and he studied China. He just loved everything about China. You call him a sinologist, I believe. And he wrote a 27-volume work, I believe. I think it was all about China, and their technological advances and discoveries. But this puzzled him too. He said, the Chinese people have all these discoveries. Why didn't they develop modern science as in the West? And he concluded also, he said, it's because they didn't have this belief in a lawgiver. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. So let's take note that the founders of the major branches of science were all believers in God, right? And they're Christians in particular. And I'm just going to list some here for you, which you can take a look at later on. Of course, there's Robert Gross test about the inductive and experimental method, which is really the basis for science. Roger Bacon, who was a monk. William Occam's razor, you've heard about that. What is the simplest explanation? It's probably the best. All kinds of scientific branches here. Again, modern anatomy, Vesalius, Copernicus, astronomy, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, Galileo, astronomy, William Harvey on circulation of the blood, Pascal, again, another famous scientist, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, one of the greats. We have Leibniz on calculus. Some of these really surprised me. So Volta on electric current, Ampere, Ohm, Faraday, Simpson, Pasteur, Mendel on genetics, very, very germane to our discussion today. Lister and aseptics, Maxwell, you may be familiar with Maxwell's equations. Those 4 equations are so elegant in describing forces, electromagnetism. So how is this possible? Well, we have to recognize that science was born in the university, and the university was really invented by the church. Almost all scientists in those times worked in church-sponsored universities, and many clergy were themselves scientists. Their reasoning was this is for the glory of God. We'll see why in a second. So they held the Greek and Latin books, for example, that they inherited from, for example, Aristotle. They're written by men, but what is called the Book of Nature was written by God himself. So how did this happen? I have a book by this guy, Fritjof Capra. He's not a Christian. He's kind of a mystic. But he says the notion of fundamental laws of nature was derived from belief in a divine lawgiver. Right? And this belief is deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And here again, we have Melvin Calvin, who was a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. The universe is governed by a single God, and it's not the product of the whims of many gods. This monotheistic worldview seems to be the historical foundation for modern science. Now, in addition to these views, I actually have a whole presentation on this topic, but today we're just going to skim it. Another very important factor that Christianity contributed, surprisingly, was the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So the fact that God took on human flesh, this implied that the material world is not evil in itself. So if you remember, during the time of Christ or after, there's a lot of interest in this religion of Gnosticism. And a lot of religions teach that the physical world is evil. And to become more pure and holy, you have to move away from the physical world towards the spiritual world. But because Jesus became human, the church theologians said, wait a minute, this means that the physical world in itself is okay. And we can investigate it, right? There's nothing wrong with it. So here's another important thing. Now, as you may know, Greek thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, they're very interested in trying to understand the physical world. And they did a lot of research and wrote a lot on it. And these writings passed on to the Muslim world. Right? They're very, very interested in their writings. And from the Muslim world, they went on to the Christian world. But there's an interesting difference. For whatever reason, the Muslim thinkers, they're very reluctant to question or oppose Aristotle. But in the Christian world, they said, well, everyone's a sinner. Everyone is fallen. So, we may have certain talents or certain gifts or certain intelligence, but no one's perfect. So we can question everyone, including Aristotle. And this was very important because Aristotle didn't get everything right. So they were able, in the universities, they could question anyone. There were some restrictions. For example, if you were to question the Bible, you had to be a theologian. So the church said you could question, almost anything, but if you want to question the Bible, you got to be a theologian. And that's where Galileo ran into trouble. But that's another discussion. Another important concept was God's freedom. And this was a Christian concept that God could choose to create the world any way that he wanted, versus the Greek concept, which is more based on reason or human logic. So, for example, the Greeks reasoned that the planets, how did the planets move? Well, since they're perfect, since they're in the more spiritual realm, planets should move in perfect circles. So, based on reason, that's the conclusion. But the Christian thought said, well, not necessarily so. We don't know what God did. We have to find out what he did. So, reason led the Greeks astray, on some counts, and rejecting that absolute dependence on reason enabled the church to really invent science. In Romans chapter 1. Paul writes that God has given us the book of nature, and he says, what is from nature, from looking at nature, you can clearly see the attributes of God. You can see that he exists. You can see, his divine attributes. And the church took this as a challenge. I said, oh, God has given us the book of nature. We can investigate this book and to think God's thoughts after him. In Genesis, right, in chapter 1, it says, have dominion over the earth. Does God charge Adam and Eve have dominion over the earth? Take charge of it. Figure it out. In Proverbs 25, it says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it is the glory of kings to find it out. There's another verse which is from the Catholic version of the Bible, which says, God has ordained everything by weight and measure and number, right? So this is another impetus. If you want to read further, I've provided some suggestions for you. Very interesting books on really the real history of science, not the pop history, which everybody gets in school. The second one is interesting because it compares this scientific discovery in 3 different cultures: Western culture, Islamic culture, and then I think Chinese culture, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe Indian. It might be Indian. How these cultures react to scientific discovery is very, very interesting. Of course, Rodney Stark is another author who talks about this topic. All right, so when talking about science, something that comes up a lot is the topic of evolution. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that many Christians believe or used to believe in evolution. And then we have to make the distinction between micro and macro evolution, right? So for example, Michael Behe, who is kind of one of the guys who kicked off the whole intelligent design movement, he used to believe in evolution. Even though he was a Catholic, he said, I have no problem believing in it. And he believed for a long time until his discoveries in molecular biology, said, wait a minute. So, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, he's a believer, but he also believes in evolution. Theists, due to fine-tuning, design, beauty, art. So theists believe in God for many reasons, right? Due to the fine-tuning of nature, which is a whole other presentation, the evidence of design in the world, beauty that they see, and also the order. Right? Here's something we'll take up a little bit later, the question of whether macroevolution is actually science or a religion. Again, microevolution is genetic change on a small scale, which everybody believes, right? Because we can see it happening. We see genetic change. But the question is whether this genetic change can actually lead to the things that evolutionists claim. And science says no, surprisingly so, right? The macroevolution is the whole framework which says everything we see that is living all developed through microevolution. Is that a scientific view? Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, also, many non-Christians don't believe in evolution. And many prominent scientists are included in this. And because of scientific observation, this is something's very wrong with the theory, right? It's not what I'm seeing. So that's another very interesting data point. And we can see it started even from the, I believe, 50s or 60s. Many scientists, including many mathematicians. So the Wistar conference was, I believe, a mathematics conference at which mathematicians looked at evolution and said, when we look at the probabilities of evolution, it doesn't make any sense. It's impossible, right? Basically. So very interesting. Mathematicians say, no, this doesn't work. Other scientists or researchers or authors like so Denton, he's the molecular biologist. Hitching, I think he's just a science writer. Stove is an atheist. He was, and he's since passed. Polinsky is an agnostic mathematician, I believe, and philosopher. They say, the science doesn't work for us for evolution. I came across Denton's book many years ago, and he really very well. I'll present some of that next week. Very interesting. And many major proofs, so-called proofs and predictions of evolution, have actually been falsified by science. You're just not aware of them because pop science is very different from science. So pop science goes like this. Pop science is, here's a discovery that shows that this thing we believe in evolution was wrong, right? And then at the end of the article says, we're excited to see where this new direction leads. It's going to shed light on blah blah. So they don't really say what we believe for 10, 20 years is wrong. They'll say, well, we're going to learn new things. This is very exciting. So when you read an article, in science magazines, that's what's going on. Happy talk, right? You have to learn to recognize that. The other reason people are confused about when they talk about evolution is there's a deliberate confusion, right? So what I mean is, for example, people say, oh, you don't believe in evolution, right? What they mean is, so what they've done is they've taken microevolution, which everybody accepts, and then there's macroevolution, and they say, well, evolution includes both of it. So if you don't believe in macroevolution, you're not scientific because we all know microevolution happens. We've all seen microevolution. Therefore, if you don't believe in macroevolution, you're not scientific, right? But the dirty little secret is nobody has seen macroevolution. Okay? But there's a deliberate conflation of those two terms. Here's another deliberate point of confusion. So evolution has kind of taken a lot of different fields of study which are involved in the study of evolution, and especially genetics. And they said, well, we've all seen genetics. We've seen mutations happen. We've seen how genetics works. Therefore, evolution is true. No, we agree with genetics. It hasn't shown us how evolution happens. It hasn't shown us any scientific proof, right? And surprisingly, that's the case today. We've also seen that the more we know about biology, the more we know about how genetics works, the more we've seen the predictions of evolution have been falsified. I'll present this next week, but I'll just so for example, evolutionists predicted that the more we know about how organisms develop, we will see the evolutionary connection. We'll see that they share a common evolutionary development pattern, right? But molecular biology and the study of embryology has shown the opposite. So as an example, you'll see species of frogs which look almost exactly the same, but the way they develop from an egg is totally different. And evolutionists were just baffled by this. There's no explanation for this. So the way they develop from the egg, from the cells, is also totally different. So again, new knowledge, new scientific discoveries are making evolution harder and harder to defend as scientific. So it's not much detail today. I just more in a later class. I just want to give you some knowledge to take away and run with. This image on the right is an image of so some bacteria have a hair-like appendage, like a whip, which they use to move around, right? And they use it to find food or to get away from toxins. And we discovered that this is the structure. And Michael B. in his book, he makes an argument that this kind of thing can't work if any of the parts are missing. Right? So this is what he calls irreducible complexity, and it really is a machine. And so I'll come back to that later. But some simple objections which have been known for decades and still have been resolved. And this is one of the things that brought up in the Wistar conference. So we all know what proteins are. They're crucial. They're molecules in our body which have very specific shapes and are crucial for life to occur. They perform all kinds of roles. Now, proteins are made of amino acids, right? So a chain of amino acids, there are 20 amino acids that are used in life. Actually, there are 20 amino acids and placed in a chain of different order, and they create different proteins. So you have a one-dimensional chain of amino acids which folds up into a very specific and useful shape. If you calculate the probability of formation, the correct sequence of amino acids for a protein which has 100 amino acids, you come up with these kinds of numbers. For a chain of 100 amino acids, the very strange thing about life is, so amino acids come in two flavors. There's which are mirror images of each other. So we call them left-handed and right-handed. right? And living molecules only use left-handed. If there's any right-handed amino acid in the chain, it doesn't work. Okay. And the sugars in DNA are exactly the opposite. All the sugars in DNA are all right-handed. There's no explanation for this either. So when you place an amino acid in a chain, it's got to be left-handed. What are the chances of this? It's 1 divided by 2 to the 100, right? Because there are 2 possibilities in the 100 amino acids. And then there are different types of bonds you could have for these amino acids. Well, in living molecules, they have to be peptide bonds. So that's 1 in 2 to the 99th power, because all these bonds have to be peptide bonds. You have to have the correct sequence, right? So if you add all these probabilities together, what do you get? You get 10 to the 160.
You mean 1 over 10?
That means 10, let's see, is it 1 followed by 160 zeros? That's a number that you can't even imagine, all right? Let me put it this way. How many atoms do you think there are in the entire visible universe? 10 to the what? Can you just make a guess? This is just a guess that scientists have made. 10 to the what?
75.
55?
75.
75?
Yeah,
Kind of close. The estimate, I think it's something around, I think it's 10 to the, something like 10 to the 80. All right. That means in the entire observable known universe with billions of galaxies, all the atoms, that's 10 to the 80. And the probabilities to form just one protein by chance is 10 to the 160. Right? That's why the mathematician said no, something's wrong. Now it gets much worse. A living system that needs 250 proteins, you're getting odds of 10 to the minus 40,000 to get 250 proteins, right? A protein like a ribosome, which is needed for DNA, it is hundreds of thousands of atoms which need to be configured. Okay. Not only that, once DNA is translated into a chain of amino acids, that's still not done. That chain of amino acids has to be transported to another structure shaped like a barrel. It goes into this barrel-like structure, and the structure somehow folds it into the correct form. And if it doesn't fold the correct form, it destroys the protein, right, for recycling. We don't know how that works, okay? But so, and again, as I mentioned, the DNA only uses right-handed molecules. Okay, so very, very problematic. Now, Sir Fred Hoyle, who was an agnostic, a very famous scientist, he said this: if one proceeds directly and straightforwardly in this matter, okay, and if we don't have to worry about incurring the wrath of scientific opinion, one arrives at the conclusion that biomaterials, like proteins, and so on, with the amazing measure of order, must be the outcome of intelligent design. Okay. No other possibility I've been able to think of, the notion that not only the biopolymer, like proteins, or the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial organic soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. He's not a believer, right? So his idea was it must be, alien beings or something. They created life on Earth, all right? Francis Crick, who was a co-discoverer of DNA structure, is a biologist must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why would he have to say that? It's because the more and more we discover about how life works, it's not simple chemistry. Life is based on molecular machines of incredible complexity, working in systems that are coordinated totally by machinery, molecular machines, all automatic. Bill Gates has said that the DNA is much more complex than any computer program we've ever designed. One reason for that is because it's all done by physical molecules. Everything is coordinated and decided and done by molecules, right? There's no electronic CPU to you type commands in and it happens. It's all done by molecules. Once you see this, you realize, wait a minute, something's wrong with the picture of evolution. Right? And what I call blob biology. So blob biology is what we all learned in high school. When we first learn about how living systems work, they're blobs to us. So when we're talking about photosynthesis, it's kind of like, okay, here's a green circle, all right? And light goes in the green blob, and then the green blob, something happens, and we get the products of photosynthesis. Oh, here's a cell. Okay, a cell's a blob, and it divides, and we get more cells. So on that cartoon level of biology, it's easy to be sold the picture of evolution, right? It's not until you see the details that you begin to question. But by that time, you've already accepted the theory of evolution, and it's harder to question. So let me just show you this animation. I'll be setting up the presentation, and the links are right there, and you can click on the links. So sorry about that. If you watch those videos, you see that really life operates with these amazing molecular machines, and it's the same for all the vital processes of life. They all depend on complex systems of molecular machines. Right? I mentioned before, I think Antony Flew, who was an atheist. For 50 years, he was the foremost philosopher of atheism. But just in the past few years, before he passed away, he wrote this book. He said there is a God. Okay, and there's the two factors, that were decisive in his accepting the existence of God. One was my growing empathy with the insight of Einstein and other noted scientists that there had to be an intelligence behind the integrated complexity of the physical universe. The best confirmation of this radical gulf is Richard Dawkins' comical effort to argue in the God delusion that the origin of life can be attributed to a lucky chance. If that's the best argument you have, then the game is over. So the science today points towards God. It's all in the favor of God. Right? So I've given you some suggestions for further reading here, evolution, some suggestions for videos. Discovery Science, there's a lot of videos about evolution and science. Dr. James Tour, we'll hear about a little bit more next week. He's a nanophysicist. Right? He creates little nano racing cars. Very interesting on the subject of the origins of life research. I really urge you to watch that video if you're interested in origins of life. Right? And he's talking about the real state of research, not the popular view. Yeah.
Hey, Cliff, have you looked at the Creation Museum?
Creation Museum.
They have a big institute on
creation.
science. And
Okay.
it's really, really good material. And they have a number of very prominent scientists that actually work on like a lot of the debate with the evolutionary scientists.
Yeah.
I went like at the beginning of the year, it's amazing. And they have a lot of like reading material. Like I picked up a book written by Dr. John Sanford. The topic of the book was on genetic entropy. Right, it's another way to look at how macroevolution is physically impossible, right, from the entropy standpoint, because the notion of organism can evolve from like simple machinery,
Right.
highly complex machinery like we are today, is genetically, physically impossible. And
Right.
very, very strong thesis. And there's a lot of recent scientific, data that point to that our genetic material not only is not improving, it's actually deteriorating.
Right. Actually, right. So that's something. Yeah. So you're ahead of us. There's something I was going to mention actually, but we'll mention it now, which is we discovered that evolution. A lot of the evolution we see, it works not by creating information, but by breaking or degrading existing information. And that's how we got polar bears. See, that wasn't new information. The white hair and so forth, they work by breaking information. So very interesting. It's going the wrong way, right? That's what science is discovering. So very briefly, so creation. I think I've watched some of the videos as well. They talk about things like the flood and the geology and dinosaurs and things like that. So very good presentations. Just mentioning here very briefly. If you look at the last quote, the truth is that we don't understand star formation at a fundamental level. Okay, so no matter what you've been reading in the news, in science magazine, whatever, that's pop science, right? Scientists working in the field, they all know this. They talk about how stars evolve and how we see stars being born far away. It's all nonsense. Okay, that's for public consumption. No one has seen a star being born to this day. Okay, they still can't explain how stars are created from using the Big Bang theory. Here, it's even worse. So there shouldn't be galaxies out there at all. The current theories of the Big Bang can't explain the existence of galaxies. It can't explain how stars form. It can't explain the galaxies that we see. It can't explain the groupings of galaxies. It can't explain the shapes of galaxies. So the problem explaining existing galaxies proves to be one of the thorniest in cosmology. All rights, they just shouldn't be there. Okay, we don't understand how a single star forms. Yet we want to understand how 10 billion stars form. The scary part is that if none of us knew in advance the stars exist, frontline research will offer plenty of convincing reasons for us why stars could never form. So when we say science versus Christianity, that's pop science. Pop science says, oh yeah, we know how stars form, gravity and the collapse, and eventually, they become heated up, and that's pop science. Okay, that's for high school students, that's for the general public. Real scientists, they still don't know. But they can't say that publicly. I mean, you can't admit to the public, well, our theories don't really work. So they got to dress that up and say, well, there are things we still don't understand. There's still mysteries about the formation of stars. You can phrase it that way. Of course, there's things like, light, is it a wave or is it a particle, right? It can be both. And we understand that the mathematics of the probabilities, theories, we can calculate that, we use it in our electronic products, but we still don't know why it's that way. We still don't understand. We can't explain why it's that way, right? The material world behaves in ways that scientists cannot explain. That's where we are today. Right at the very bottom of atoms and things that compose atoms, quarks and so forth, we can't explain why they behave that way. Right? But we continue to use this knowledge without understanding. So if someone claims they only believe what science can explain, that only means that they don't know what science is saying. And to conclude, I would say science is a gift from God. There are plenty of videos of discovery that talk about how nature is wonderfully designed just so we can actually discover the universe. Right? Very interesting. We have to distinguish between science and scientism. Right? Scientism is more like a religious belief in science. Right? The science will be able to explain everything, even though it can't explain it now. We got to distinguish between those two, and we have to know. We have to be confident that what we're seeing today in advances of science is increasing our awe of God. When you watch his videos, you'll see how God's mind, we think God is wise, we think God is powerful, but until you've watched those videos, you don't really understand what that means. It's just crazy. It's just insane what God had to design so we can be here, sitting here, right, and functioning. It's insane. We have to recognize that Darwinism has actually hindered science in many, many ways. And first of all, we have the horrors of the communist and Nazi massacres of the 20th century, which derive from Darwinism. That we saw last couple of weeks. Darwinism predicted things like vestigial organs, right? So all these organs now are useless because they're the vestiges, the remains of evolution. Well, today we know it's not true. Over 100 organs, which Darwinists said were vestigial, today we know that they actually have functions, and many of them have important functions. For example, the thymus. You can see how the thymus functions, right? For the longest time, we thought the thymus was vestigial. Today we know it's vital to our immune system. The thymus gland is a boot camp for our immune cells. The thymus. This is mind blowing. Let me just. I just have to tell you. So the thymus gland has copies of like the 200 types of cells in our body, right? And it has copies of parts of them, and it exposes immune cells to these copies to make sure that the immune cells don't attack these cells. See, that's how your body recognizes body cells from invaders. In stark contrast to what Darwinism said. Junk DNA. So Darwinists said, oh, these stretches of DNA, they don't seem to do anything. They're just junk DNA, which is the result of evolution. Today we know that's completely wrong. junk DNA plays very, very important roles in how we function. Okay, some of it is like programming, making decisions. Some of it is scaffolding. It's mechanical structure because of the 3D structure of the chromosomes. Right, completely wrong with that. Darwinists point to examples of bad design. They say, for example, the human eye. They say, oh, that's bad design because the blood vessels are in the wrong place. It's facing the nerve cells are facing the wrong way. Well, today we know that's wrong. Okay, so another example is microbial resistance. Nobody really did the math until now to find out that bacteria and parasites, they can't just keep evolving unlimitedly to resist medications. If a mutation to resist requires 2 simultaneous mutations, the odds of them evolving are much harder to find. So Darwinism could have stopped us from developing better antibiotics. So Darwinism really is a hindrance to science. As believers, I think also this really drives home who God really is. Who's the God we worship, right? It should increase our awe of God and our appreciation of God. And also, when we talk about difficult subjects like suffering and hell, I think it also helps us to see, the care that God has put into the creation. I think to believe that He will do what is best and what is right. I think it helps us to believe in that.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, right? I mean, if God can create stuff like this, I mean, I can trust Him. I can trust Him in other things. So
you're very good, Cliff, very good argument that you presented, because very often you hear people say, I cannot see any reason why God would allow this to happen or do it like this. Well, that you don't know doesn't mean that there's no reason, right? So it's really, who do you think is God? You think you know better? Then no, that's where the line is from, right?
So that's the whole class on the topic of suffering right there. So we don't need to do it. That's the whole class right there. Well, let's pray. We'll end the class here, and then if you want to stick around a bit, or if we can, then we will. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that you can give us confidence that the reality still points to you when we know more and more about it. It is only in our ignorance of these things that we can sit back and make objections. And we pray that you help us to appreciate more and more of who you are through your creation, through the book of nature. Help us to share with others as well, to see this just amazing things that you have done, and to worship you for really the wise and amazing and powerful and loving and gracious God that you are. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.